So welcome everyone to another edition of History Hound Presents. I'm very excited today to have Malcolm Watts with me. He's going to talk to us about Bogarttown. He wrote a very interesting book on Bogarttown, so we're going to be referring to that as we go along. And we're going to be asking Malcolm some questions about Bogarttown so that we can all learn a little bit more about this hamlet that was on the outskirts of Newmarket and is now part of Newmarket. So welcome, Malcolm. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for inviting me.
So Malcolm, I always ask the same question whenever I meet somebody. Why Bogarttown? Why were you interested in writing a book on Bogarttown?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for it, Rick. One being that they're very close to, we live just outside the Newmarket town borders, and so we attended Bogarttown School. So I was interested in the community. I knew people there, and the other thing is that I'm very interested in local history and the fact that basically most of Bogarttown's infrastructure has disappeared, including the sign that used to be at the corner of Leslie and Mulock. It means that many people either they only know Bogarttown as a name on a board, or perhaps not even that. So I wanted to let people know that this place existed at one time, and what was its place in the history of Upper Canada.
Give us an idea of the actual area of Bogarttown. How much land did Bogarttown once take up?
Well, I think if you on a map, if you put a compass on right at Leslie and Mulock, that would roughly be a quarter mile, half a mile, maybe. That would roughly be the catchment of Bogarttown, give or take. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a fairly big area. I know that at one time people thought that Bogarttown was going to keep pace with, if not outdo, Newmarket. So why do you think it is that Bogarttown, I guess, ceased to be important and Newmarket grew instead?
Mm-hmm. Well, any village or town or settlement site must have a reason, a raison d'etre, as they say. There must be a purpose to it, and Bogarttown was there was a mill, a couple of mills there, and there were blacksmith shops, a couple of other businesses, and so on, and basically it was a place where the early settlers could bring logs to get them sawed to so they could build houses and barns and such like, and they could get their mill, their wheat ground at the mill. But what happened is over between sort of 1810 maybe to up to 1850, there was a proliferation of competing enterprises along the Holland River in the current Newmarket area, particularly Joe Hill's large grist mill on Ferry Lake, as we know, and there was a sawmill, and there were several along the Holland River. So eventually, there was not really a need for mills in Bogarttown. And the other thing was the retail sector was growing in Newmarket, and so it became more profitable, I think, for merchants to move the little distance over to Newmarket and have a much larger clientele. Of course, the biggest thing was when the Simcoe Huron Railway was extended north from what was where it had terminated out, and it was extended up. Once that happened, basically, the corridor along the railway, which ran along basically around the Holland River, was far preferable for many reasons, and so Newmarket grew and Bogarttown shrank.
Well, we also, for those people who don't know who the Bogarts were, maybe you could give us a little idea who the Bogarts were and why the Bogarts are a name that's renowned in the annals of local history.
Okay, well, it's interesting. The in 17 or take, Lieutenant Governor Simcoe put out notices all through eastern Canada and down in the United States that they were providing free land grants depending on your situation and so on, and this appealed to a lot of people down in the eastern former 13 colonies, because particularly since the American Revolution, anyone who had been even neutral with regard to the War of Independence was not looked upon kindly. And if you were actively a royalist down there, well, you could very well be thrown off your property and tarred and feathered and run out of town. So it was not a friendly place for people who were of royalist, the royalist bent. The other thing was there was a great influx of population into the colonies there around that time, and the price of land was skyrocketing. And they had not completed the Louisiana Purchase, and that would not be completed until after they had figured out what they were going to do about the Aboriginal people who were not that keen about giving up that area. So there began to be problems with the native people down there, and so for a number of reasons, it made sense to think about, moving north into Upper Canada, and where you might get free land or land at very low cost, and there's lots of room for your children and your children's children to have families and develop farms and enterprises.
And do you know when they actually did come here? I know that they have a Dutch background, so I said they went to the United States first and then up here. Any idea when they came up here?
Yes, well, the first Bogarts came very early to New Amsterdam from Holland, and so they were in the New World very early, and had already spread into the areas around New York, around the Hudson River, New York, specifically Brooklyn and New Jersey, and then from there moving up into the other colonies, Pennsylvania and so on. So quite a large family, really. There. Now the Bogarts that we're immediately concerned with came from Pennsylvania. And what happened was Martin Bogart, who was the elder statesman of the Bogart clan, he saw these notices about lands for lease and grant in Upper Canada, and he decided he would come up and check it out. So he came up here about 1797, and up to York, and heard good things about this area up around in what was known as Whitchurch, which is sort of the area roughly around, you know, the Newmarket and catchment area. And the land was good. There was water there to build a mill, and he was able to lease a large clergy reserve property, and then he returned back down to Pennsylvania to organize the family to emigrate. Now, the unfortunate thing was Martin Bogart. He was older by then, and he never made it back. He died down in Pennsylvania there shortly after he returned south. But his son, John Bogart, and his Martin Bogart's, John's wife, their children, and Mary Opp, who had been Martin Bogart's wife, John Bogart's mother. The large group of them, they came up in about 1802, and to the land that Martin Bogart had leased, and began to clear land and you know, build shelter. And by 1805, John Bogart had built a grist mill on the Bogart. It had dammed the river and created the Bogart Mill Pond, and first opened a sawmill and then a grist mill.
Well, so was he successful down in the United States? Is this, I mean, must be quite an enterprise. I'm always amazed with people who leave their country and come to Canada and do very well. And you always wonder whether they were doing well where they were before, or whether this was just a change of scenery brought out the entrepreneur in them.
Well, I think they had done well down there, but I think Martin Bogart was thinking ahead in terms of his grandchildren, and the fact that the price of land was increasing, and it was becoming much more scarce. And of course, as the population grew down there, and the pressure came to move the native people off the lands and push them further west, and this, of course, as I said, created you know, serious conflict with the Aboriginal people. I think he just felt that the family would be much better off up here, but down there, I think they had probably been very, you know, quite well off. I mean, not incredibly wealthy, but I'm sure that they were quite prosperous for the time.
Yeah. Well, it'd be quite a trip up here for sure. And you know, as I say, one of the things I love about history is when you take a look at these families, like my own family, the Lundys, who took that long trek up from the United States to Canada on foot with their oxen and whatever to start a new life. You have to give these people credit, you know, for doing so. So he comes up here. I assume that because the pond was dammed, that the house that, you know, it seems to me we're always talking about, which is the Bogart House, that's in such a state of disrepair. Was that house built at that time?
That actually was John Bogart's second house. and it it was a fine example of a two-story house, similar to the ones down in the United States of the Georgian period, and probably was the nicest house around for a very long time, yeah.
Well, he also
And that became the house where the house was, and the mill was, that really became the center of Bogarttown hamlet, right there, and you know, and other enterprises grew up in that immediate area.
yeah. Well, you know, I know that you know, we've all been quite concerned about what's going to happen to the house, and you know, from what I understand, you know, I guess to simplify it, there seems to be two parties of or thoughts about it. Some people say, you know, it's too badly destroyed, so you know, why bother? Why spend money? There's people who'll say that over the years, the integrity of the house has been damaged. It's no longer the original house. It was modernized, so maybe it isn't worth keeping. And then there's those people who say because it was a Bogart house, because it was one of the first houses that was built in the area, and because of who owned it and the history of Bogarttown, that it's well worth keeping. I know that you were with Heritage Newmarket. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have to say that my thoughts on the Bogart House in that regard have kind of fluctuated over the years, because there is sort of a sentimental historical part of me that would love to see that house restored, perhaps as it was prior to its restorations in 1870, when there was major construction, and the back part of the house was built in brick. But there's another part of me that, having been in that house several times in the last 10 years, and seeing the degree of degradation and damage, and because it's been open to the elements, and people have been in there and taking away you know, trim and molding and one thing and another, and that plus the house is said to be now structurally unsound. So I can't say that I'm clear about what should happen. Certainly, the site should be marked as that having been there, but I do feel kind of sad, because it really is sort of the last link to old Bogarttown, especially since Bogarttown School was moved in 1969 down to Vandorf to become a museum.
Yeah, a lot of people probably aren't aware that you know, until his passing, this is where Bill Elliott, the teacher from Newmarket High, lived with his wife, and I guess, you know, he lived there right up to his passing. I was always you know, concerned about the house. I used to talk to his children and say, I hope he's taking good care of the house. As it turned out, I guess he was unable to do so, to keep it up to the standard. But you know, this happens with a lot of old houses. That it costs a lot of money and a lot of effort to maintain them. Unfortunately, this is something that, you know, you and I, as people who are into history, are going to have to try and figure out some solution to this. What do we do with old properties? You know, how do you repurpose them? How do you keep them alive? You know, I know, like you, I have mixed thoughts, because I'm not really thrilled about having my tax dollars go to restore old houses. I'd kind of like to see them repurposed and used. And, you know, this is probably part of a larger discussion we'll have at some point, Malcolm, as to what the future will bring as far as repurposing of old buildings. There's a lot of them around Newmarket that are in danger. So the Bogarts, a little bit about my family. The Lundys were sort of in a peculiar situation during the War of 1812 because many of them had moved up to, obviously, as I said, to Ontario, and the Bogarts as well were well represented in the American forces, and it'd be interesting to know how that worked out with the Bogart family. I know, as I say, the funny story that we have in our family is that when the Americans reached the border into Niagara Falls, when the fighting wasn't on, they used to go and visit their relatives on this side of the border in Niagara Falls, have a nice dinner, maybe a picnic out front, and then at the end of the picnic, they would pack up and go back over to the American side, with I guess the idea that tomorrow they would come and take the land and kill their relatives. So, kind of a peculiar situation, Malcolm. Any interesting stories about that, like that with the Bogarts? I imagine they were divided too.
I don't really know that much about the politics of the Bogarts, about the Bogart family. I do know that the economic history of the 19th century in Canada was very much a boom and bust story, and of course during the War of 1812. People with materials that the military would be able to use, and the military, of course, would pay for their whatever they got with what we called warrants, and warrants were basically like cash, and it could be used, throughout the colony, like cash, and so that was a prosperous time. It was a good time, and I'm sure that that really gave a boost to the Bogarttown economic enterprises, to the extent that for a period of time up to 1850, the Bogarttown apparently was pretty well known for the large amount of wheat, flour that was ground there and then shipped to Montreal to be transported to Europe. So, along with some of the other enterprises, such as the woolen factory. That was kind of sort of the heyday of it, and but as far as the Bogarts' view of political politics and so on, I'm not that familiar with it.
No, I think probably the best thing that you could possibly do back in those days is be apolitical. Your success depended on neither side being unhappy with you. So we know that John Bogart's large mill burned in 1867, and he built a smaller mill on the same site. I assume too that I was at the heritage meeting when they brought up the topic of the ruins of an old mill that they found at the end of the Bogarttown pond, and there were people who were suggesting that this was, in fact, one of the mills, one of the grist mills. But I had suggested that it was my understanding that it was probably a woolen mill, because even if it was rebuilt in 1867, they still were not going to build that in brick, and that building is very clearly brick where they just recently found the remains. Or I don't know. It's funny. I feel strange in saying they just discovered it. Frankly, it was under weeds, and the only reason why they now know that it's there is because they removed the weeds. And but I remember as a child, I'm sure you do too, getting on your bike and going for a ride out there, and it was one of the places that you would go and visit.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah, I would be more inclined to say that that structure there is in fact gristmill or sawmill that was on the pond.
Okay.
The woolen mill was further down Bogart Pond in the area of where the present College Manor subdivision is towards on the corner of that uh, large piece of property and Gorham Street. Um, and there, of course, there were the two woolen mills. The first one having been extremely successful, they built a second one further down Bogart Creek, closer to Gorham Street. Eli Gorham had purchased 4 carding machines for carding wool in the United States and brought them up, and he sold a couple of the machines here and there, and initially he set up his carding mill in Joseph Hill's mill in Newmarket there. But then as it became more prosperous, he was able to build a dedicated mill, woolen mill, and it was a grist mill also, and in that area near College Manor there on Bogart Creek. And that business was so successful that in a few years, they needed a larger facility, and so that was built. Interestingly, I've never been able to locate any evidence of the larger mill, but certainly the first woolen mill there is quite quite interesting. And lately they've been clearing away. They replaced that bridge, and they've been clearing away a lot of the underbrush, and you get a better idea of the setup for it. And you can kind of see where there would have been 2 mill raceways. So that probably they would have had a couple of wheels running, one perhaps for the grist mill, one for the sawmill.
Yeah, I think they were a real going concern. Lately, I've been doing a series of articles on our Indigenous history, which is something that's been sadly neglected, I think, locally. And it intrigued me because Bogarttown was mentioned in the ongoing political fight or legal fight between the First Nations and the government over the fact that it wasn't until 1923 that they discovered that that the people who were given land, including my relatives in this area in Newmarket and further north, had no right to be given that land because the treaty that was signed, the Toronto Treaty that was signed back late 1700s, early 1800s, did not cover this area. And so in 1923, they finally coerced the Indigenous people into signing a new treaty, which would cover all the land north and to the east of here, as far as Peterborough. Keeping that in mind, I kind of wonder. You mentioned about the uncertainty with the Indigenous people in the United States with the Bogarts. I'm sure if they had known that all of this land that they had purchased or were granted by the government could at any day be taken away, I'm sure that would have made them very nervous as well.
Well, I would assume so, but I can't say that I am by any means an expert in the history of the treaties and so on, but my understanding of the Toronto Purchase was that the northern boundary, although it seemed a little bit unclear, was more in line with Holland Landing, so that would have meant that the Bogart area would have been covered. John Stegman had, you know, of course, laid out the main Young Street and so on, and subsequently then you know, the surveys were made for the lots, and I would think that that would not have happened unless there was some kind of legal title to the property.
Well, one would think so. I just finished a two-parter for, you know, articles that I wrote for Newmarket today. And
Yes.
as part of that, I went down to the archives. I was intrigued by the fact that the Indigenous people of the area just saw, I guess you'd say, ended a legal challenge in the courts, and they won, but a legal challenge in the courts. And so I went down, and in fact, the original Toronto purchase, if you want to call it a purchase, because they didn't really buy the land, they just took it. But the original Toronto purchase ended at the Bloomington Side Road.
Oh.
And so Aurora and Newmarket and up were not included. And they assumed, I think, that that it included the other parts of Ontario further up, but it didn't. And as I say, in 1923, the Ontario government hurried to induce the Indigenous people to sign an additional treaty to cover that, you know, that area, which I found amazing because, as I say, you mentioned about Yonge Street, and you obviously, you know, the government thought that they owned that land, or that they had acquired that land, or whatever you want to call what they did. They obviously believed that, or they wouldn't have, you know, gone to all the trouble of building all those houses, or all building Yonge Street and allowing all those houses to be there. I'm sure my relatives would have just absolutely freaked out if they had known that the title that they got, or I guess that Timothy Rogers got, and that they bought into, wasn't a legal fact. But in 1923, it became a legal fact. And
well,
but that's
it is interesting because one of the main intentions of building Yonge Street was to provide a military connection between Lake Ontario and Georgian Bay, and so I would assume that Governor Simcoe would have been relatively assured that at least in the area around the Yonge Street, they must have had some kind of title to it. But it's a very good question.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. When I went down to the archives, they actually had letters from Simcoe saying, "Are you absolutely sure that this is covered?" Because if you take a look at the tree, which, you know, I was able to do, I wasn't able to touch it or anything, but I was able to look at it. It specifically gives the lot number, and if you take a look at an old map, you'll see that it is indeed only covers up to Bloomington. But that's a different story in itself. You have some wonderful pictures in your book of the blacksmith shop and the school. You said you went to the school. Tell us a little bit about going to school in I assume back then it was probably still a one-room schoolhouse.
Well, by the time I went there, it was a two-room school.
Oh, wow.
They had excavated the basement. It was a one-room school until early 1950s. The basement was, actually in the 30s, they excavated the basement. They put a basement under the one-room school. But interestingly, it was not used as a school room initially. It was used more as like a community center, and they had the Sunday school, I think, met there, and one thing and another. In 1952, the enrollment of the school became such that they were required to use that, do further renovation in that space, and hire an elementary teacher, grade 1 to 4, and that was Verna Weiss. She was the first. She was the first one. Yeah.
I'm interested in your, your book. You talk a little bit about, deforestation. They took down, I guess, all of the trees, or most of the trees, and it became a little bit of a dust bowl in Bogarttown. That's hard to imagine, but I suppose that happened everywhere. We were cutting down trees left and right.
Well, yes, yes, that whole area, in the vicinity of present day Gormley and the Vivian Side Road and Highway 48, that whole area was a type of soil that did not renew itself that well, and once they started clearing the land, like the sand, it just literally would blow away, and so it wasn't probably the most productive land in the area. But the forest went. This is another factor that also, that I think, led to the fact that the sawmill in Bogarttown became somewhat unnecessary, because in fact, by 1850, 1860, a large proportion of the old growth forest in the former wilderness, which roughly today we would call it York Region, had been eliminated, and so that they, in fact, with the train going through in 1850, 52, 55, in that area, they began bringing. It was cheaper to bring lumber down from North Bay, from that area, on the train. And
I can remember the story. When I did my article on the canal, this was one of the rationale for building of the canal, was that they would be able to bring barges of lumber down to service the industries, in the area. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the connection of the Stickwood Farm and Bogarttown.
Well, the Stickwood Walker Farm, it was on one of the original settled lots, quite a, either 100 or 200 acres. I'm not sure whether it was a full lot or a half lot. Stickwoods operated a brick making business in Newmarket, near Shrigley Street and Prospect Street, place we used to call it the Brick Fields, and presumably it had a special kind of clay that they produce very nice yellow brick. Unfortunately, it was also not that durable. But the old town hall in Newmarket and many of the houses are constructed of Stickwood brick, as is the Stickwood farmhouse, which is it's located on today on Mulock, and just east of the new Magna Center Recreation. That whole area where the Magna Center is, and some of that, those apartments that they built, that was all part of the Stickwood Farm. And the Walkers had lived there. Frances Walker and her husband and children, they had lived there for, well, I'm probably from the 40s or the 50s at least. And owned it until about 20 years ago when finally it was Stickwood, Francis Walker died, and the children decided to sell the property for development.
Well, it is a property that thank God is protected by the the town or by Heritage Newmarket. Although I always watch with interest every time I go to the committee meetings, because they have all these wonderful ideas of what they would like to do on the property. And I remember mentioning to them that if they intend to build a building in front of the house, that seems kind of counterproductive. It's the house that people want to see, not a warehouse or I forget. No, I think at that time what it was that they were going to put a daycare in there, and they were talking about putting a building between the road and the house, which would have been a total disaster. But
oh, I see. I understood the daycare center would be within the confines of the house.
That's what they eventually decided to do, because thank God the planning department said agreed and said what we need to do is although they are allowing them to build a building beside the Stickwood Walker farmhouse. So I don't know. At least it's not going to block the view.
Yeah,
and
well, I am pleased that one of the things that we were able to accomplish when I was on the Heritage Committee, very late in our mandate there, we went up to the Stickwood Walker House there with planning people and some other people, and we were able to outline some of the things that the house needed. And fortunately, the town had agreed to put a sizable sum of money in to pay for some of these things. And if you go up there now, you can see that that old sales pavilion that sat in front there for many years is gone.
Yep.
And a lot of the trees and the brush that basically sort of block the house have been removed, and the paintwork and so on has been upgraded. So the property is certainly better off, and I believe it will be good with having a purpose there that'll draw people in there.
Exactly. Repurposing of an old building is what we said before. And unfortunately, a lot of people probably remember that they had a fire there and the barn burned. And Ernie Crosland had made it one of his projects to replace the barn with a barn just like it. But unfortunately, I guess he passed before he could make that. So a couple of people, before we leave, we should talk about a couple of characters. Well, I don't know if you call them characters, because people define character as differently than perhaps I do, but a couple of people that we should take a look at who called Bogarttown home. Colonel Beresford, who I know you were having a little bit of a time tracking down information on him. You want to tell us a little bit about him?
Well, yes, certainly. He would definitely meet the definition of being a character. William Henry Beresford was the son of lower level upper class people in Ireland, and particularly on his mother's side. He joined the British military in around 1830. He enlisted there, and in the 95th Rifle Infantry, 95th Infantry of Foot, And he was a career soldier. He then, shortly after his joining the forces, he purchased a commission, a captain's commission, which was a common thing in those days. And in fact, it's a little bit like the taxi license thing in recent times. When you were finished with your commission, you could sell it. So it was kind of an investment. And we don't know a whole lot about how he wound up in Whitchurch here, but my assumption is that because I have looked at the history of his rifle company, and you know, they were situated in Halifax and Montreal, and York. And I assume that when he was posted in York, he probably had heard about Whitchurch. Maybe he had traveled up here, and he liked the land and decided that that would be where he'd like to settle after he left the military in 1850. He was not a pleasant individual. He was you know, a very difficult man to deal with, but he had big ideas. Probably ideas were sort of bigger than his britches, as they used to say in those days. And he purchased a piece of property in the area of Bogarttown, which it's known as Pleasantville, really. And
the east, is it?
yes, it's east, and so it's Vivian Road and Leslie Street. There, if you make a diagonal line from that corner, you know, to the west, northwest, to the area of the creek there. That's approximately where he would had a farm, and he built a beautiful mud brick mansion. And it seems hard for us to sort of, you know, think about that in these days. You think, oh, you build a house out of mud, that sounds kind of primitive. But in fact, it was a very sturdy and effective way of construction that had been used in England and elsewhere, and involved, you know, mashing up straw and clay together, and then placing it into molds and drying them in the sun, and then you know, then they could go ahead and construct the place. And it was a beautiful house. It had many rooms. It had Gothic windows. It had big doorways, several fireplaces, and Beresford married Harriet Lawrence in around that time, presumably getting the house. They were actually married in Montreal, as far as I can figure it. I assume that her family may have been down there, although there is some suggestion that there are Lawrences in the Whitchurch area, and that possibly would have been one of the reasons why you know, Beresford decided to go up there. She wanted to be near her family. We don't know that, but it's a possibility. But it was an unhappy situation. It was a very short marriage, and had one child. He went broke, and he had to sell it, and he owned and sold several other properties over the years, and finally ended up living in York, and he died in York in about 1885. And he is buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery. And I've recently been able to locate the exact lot plot number, and I plan to go visit it this summer sometime.
Cool. Well, one of my first interviews that I did long time ago was a gentleman that it was suggested that I do an interview with. I really didn't connect him to either to Newmarket or to Bogarttown, but this gentleman had gone to school at the University of Toronto. He was a Bogarttown boy, and as part of the sort of the preamble to my interview, I said, "What would you like people to know about you?" And he said, "Well, a lot of people are fascinated by the fact that I'm the third most wealthiest person in North America." And that, of course, was Mr. McMillan, who was McMillan Waddell. He talked about growing up on, I guess his family couldn't look after him. I guess they were poor and there were some issues. And so he grew up on a farm around Pleasantville, actually.
Yes, Bogarttown School.
And he went to Bogarttown School, and he talked a little bit about that. So that was the other person. It's funny, we don't know very much about a lot of the people who grew up in Newmarket. That's one of the reasons why I'm currently doing this Characters of Newmarket project that people are voting on the History Hound. So eventually Bogarttown was annexed or became part of Newmarket. Any idea when that happened?
Well, I think it was a fading away process between a period of about 1850 to 1900. By 1900, there really was not very much left there, with the exception of some farmhouses. The house was there, of course. There was still the remnants of the sawmill, gristmill at Bogart Pond. There's some controversy about when that stuff disappeared. Some people saying it disappeared in a storm in the area of 1918. A severe storm knocked it down. Other people are saying that when that property was sold around the period of World War II, the new owners cleared the land of all of the what was left of the mill, which probably wasn't that much.
Well, I can remember, as I alluded to earlier, getting on my bike and going for a ride out there. And even though Bogarttown, as you say, disappeared probably before 1900, my mother always called it Bogarttown, as did all of our family. And I grew up calling that Bogarttown. So, it's retained its name. You talk to a lot of people, and they're talking about that area, they'll still refer to it as Bogarttown, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And as you say, there's no sign there anymore. So, but again, like most things, I fear as time passes, less and less people are going to know about the story of Bogarttown, and that is truly sad. But I want to thank you for talking to me about this. And I put up on the screen a cover of your book for those people who out there who are interested in the story of Bogarttown. This is an excellent book.
Absolutely.
And I would suggest that once we're able to get out and about, that you head down to the museum on Main Street. I know last time I checked, they still had copies of this book. Is there going to be another edition coming out of this book? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
We did some corrections and so on after the first round, and no further stuff is planned right now. Although I do have a lot of material with regard to the school that I may put together in a separate book about pioneer schools in Upper Canada, specifically using Bogarttown School as an example, of course. You know, as material becomes more available, you know, we may need to add some things, and so down the road, perhaps a different publication, or maybe a new publication on the whole Newmarket history that would have a section on Bogarttown.
On Bogarttown. Well, I'm glad you did the first one. Fascinating read, as I said. I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm hoping that you're going to take up another project and do just as good a job on that. I thank you very much for joining me, Malcolm, and
thank you, Rick.
You're welcome back anytime to talk history. Nothing better than talking history.
Can I just say one more thing? Anyone watching who you know, has some stories or you know, ephemera or relics from the Bogarttown period, or stories, I'd be very interested in talking with them. They could contact me through the museum. What I would really love is, and I believe that somebody must have photographs of some of the buildings in Bogarttown Center before it kind of vanished. So if anyone has anything like that, I would really like to get hold of it so we can get that in the archives.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. So they can either get a hold of you through the museum, or if you want, you can just send an email to the History Hound, and I'll make sure that I send all the information over to Malcolm. So
perfect. That would be good.
You can take care of it. So thank you very much, Malcolm.
Thank you, Rick.
Stay safe and keep the faith.
I will.
Take care. Bye-bye.